Hi everyone, my name is Rose, also known as Tia Summers. Welcome back to my channel. When it comes to critiquing different books and when it comes to like determining best of lists, worst of lists, like I said in the previous video with my 10 worst books, what it boils down to for me is every person has things that they like and they have things that they dislike, and it's just relative in the scheme of things. If we can have conversations about books, ultimately it's worth it. With that being said, I am about to go into the worst books that I read in the year of 2022. So this is a combination video of most disappointing books that I read this year, as well as the worst books. And there's really only two books. One's a full-length novel, and the other one's a novella that I had like that were just the absolute worst. One of them I gave 1 star, the other one I gave 0 stars, and we'll get to that at the end of this video. But I really had a wonderful reading year overall. My average rating on Goodreads for all the books that I marked, which were a total of 100 books, ended up being 4.0 stars, which I have never had a reading year be that high in quite some time. So, genuinely speaking, I enjoyed so many books this year. So many books. So, these were kind of the odd ones of the bunch. So without further ado, we're gonna go ahead and jump in. So I'm not going in any particular order of from best to worst kind of thing, other than the fact that the first section of this video is going to be my more disappointing reads of 2022, and then the last part is going to be my worst reads of 2022. So not all of these were published in the year of 2022. Some of them were, but not all of them were. So I'll get to that when I get to that. The first book that I am going to talk about in this video is actually one that got a lot of controversy earlier this year. This is the first book in this particular series of the same title as the book. It's Lightlark by Alex Astor. And I know what you're going to say to this. Was Lightlark really that bad? Yes, the reception of it was definitely mixed. I think I was actually more generous to it than other people were. And from what I have seen from my peers, in terms of people that I trust who have reflected on this particular book and stuff like that, they picked up on things that I did not during the read, because I read it on audiobook. My Name is Namani Ness actually had a very comprehensive review on Lightlark in terms of delineating the reasons that she did not like that book at all. Reads with Rachel did a wonderful job of breaking down all of the issues with Lightlark as well. And she was one of the reviewers that actually was the first person that I saw that compared it to Caraval by Stephanie Gruber, and I'm like, that makes so much sense, because I actually did like Caraval, but I took issues with that. But eventually I'll get to a point where I do formally review Caraval on my channel and also on Goodreads. But what it boils down to in terms of Lightlark, and I've talked about it on my wrap up for the month that I read it, which I believe was in September of this year, it really did not do well with its respective world building. It dropped the ball. It was so threadbare. And there are so many stereotypes that it kind of capitalizes on that doesn't really make it unique. Plot elements that tangibly did not really make sense if you look back on them and see. It had the potential to be a better young adult fantasy than what it was. And I do think I've already said that I'm probably going to pick up the second book in the Lightlark series just to see where it goes, if it improves, but we'll see how it goes. Alice Astor is not a new author. This was just a new book in the scope of YA for her. She previously published several, I think it was two middle grade titles, if I remember correctly, that you could also find on Goodreads, but I have not read those. But this was her first YA title. And I think in terms of the concept of the dystopian story and the fantasy story did have merits to it that could have been better than what they were, but the way that they were executed was very derivative of other young adult fantasies and really did not do enough to make it distinctive and to come out of a lot of cliches, even some of those cliches being harmful towards certain groups. So the what I gave this particular uh book was, I believe it was 2.5 stars on my Goodreads rating. Yeah, 2.5 stars. And one of the reasons why it was so strong, in my opinion, in terms of why I gave it that high of a rating, was because the audiobook narration was good, and it was by a person that I really love as an audiobook narrator. It was so Susie Jackson has been a veteran in terms of narrating several young adult series, especially even young adult fantasy. But otherwise, it would not have elevated this particular book up to the level that it was at all if it wasn't for Susie Jackson's performance for this audiobook. So I'm going to say that it was one of the more disappointing. It was not the worst book that I read this year, but it was definitely one of the more disappointing ones. And I talk about it in my previous review. I'll also link the other reviews of the booktubers I mentioned in this video down below for your reference, and their comprehensive reviews on this. So that was Lightlark by Alex Astor, one of the more disappointing reads of 2022 for me. I first see myself getting into so much trouble with respect to this next book that I am going to feature, because this author is so popular among literary circles. And this was the year that I read several titles from this particular author, and I actually liked her other titles better than this particular one, but you'll know why I mentioned this one once we get to that. My second most disappointing book in the year of 2022 was Conversations with Friends by Sally Rooney. Yeah, I am being very serious. It's one of those books where I thought it was tedious to get through from start to finish because of a lot of the things that it deals with in the spectrum of this particular novel. It does deal with infidelity. It has a relationship that I was definitely not okay with in the spectrum of things for this particular novel, but that wasn't even just the worst part of it for me, like in terms of trying to get to know the characters and trying to get to know for, like, you're going into a novel where all the characters are essentially unlikable, and you're just waiting to see when the shoe drops, when things start rolling along in terms of like seeing the consequences of these characters' actions. But for me, the compelling part, like some of the most compelling literature that I have read, are narratives that even with unlikable characters, they compel me want to see where they end up, and this one did not do that for me, unfortunately. I remember the anticipation of wanting to pick up this book by Sally Rooney because I was on a month's long hold trying to get it from my library because so many people were checking out this book, Normal People, as well as Beautiful World, Where Are You? Which, of the three books that I have read by Sally Rooney, Beautiful World, Where Are You is actually my favorite of the three. But with respect to Conversations with Friends, I could say that, like, it's not so much that I disliked the writing in and of itself, but I just felt like that I could not follow the character. Had no compelling reason to follow the characters, and it felt tedious for me to get through, to be able to follow Frances and being able to follow her relationship with Bobby, and essentially the cheating relationship that happens with Nick, who is a 30-year-old actor who is cheating on his wife, who has been cheating on his wife, and has not stopped cheating on his wife, and she's inherently knowing of that, but doesn't realize that Nick is cheating with Frances. And essentially, with seeing these very privileged people in their 20s and 30s living their lives accordingly and being flawed from start to finish, I just felt like This book did not pull me in the way that normal people did, as well as Beautiful World, Where Are You, where I could actually see some themes that I could relate to. Even if it wasn't my experience, I could at least relate to the characters and see where they were emotionally and wanting to follow them a little bit more. Normal people still kind of left me on the fence on things, but I did like how it handled certain pieces of trauma. And Beautiful World, Where Are You did a lot better job of handling where emotionally where all of its characters were in the spectrum of the novel for me, like in terms of following along. But I thought that Conversations with Friends just did not work for me in the way that I wanted it to. I gave this book, I still like pieces of Conversations with Friends, don't get me wrong. I gave it 2.5 out of 5 stars. Overall, it's not a book that I would really like gravitate towards in her bibliography again. I would probably pick up Normal People again, and I would probably pick up Beautiful World, Where Are You? But I probably would not pick up Conversations with Friends again. And so that's one of my more disappointing reads of 2022. I gave it 2.5 out of 5 stars, and I'm just leaving that where it is. This next pick should not surprise anyone with respect to how much I talked about it in my spoilerish kind of review for my monthly wrap up. Uh, Back when I read it, it is the final book in this respective Dark Academia trilogy that I read back in October. This is the Golden Enclaves, which is the third in the Scholomance series by Naomi Novik, and I had so many things that I needed to say about this particular book. It to sum it up, what made it disappointing to me was for all the build up that it had in the previous two books. This felt like a letdown with not only the inconsistent characterization drawings of this particular novel, but it also for events did not make sense. For some characters who were relatively minor or had like different personalities in the very beginning of the book to suddenly become pronounced, Liesel's character in particular, to only be tossed aside when another character decides to show back up in the picture. And then also for the level, there were pieces of the Golden Enclaves that I could appreciate with respect to how Elle's character had more focus like on like her father's side of the family and the discoveries that she makes in terms of what her role was delineated as in terms of being this harbinger of bad, and like the rivalry that she has with Orion, and even the way that she grieves Orion when certain events happen. But at the same time, it felt like so many of the other characters who had more notable roles in the beginning of the series just were reduced to nothing in this one. And then even major characters who had very, very pronounced roles just basically were told their respective reactions. In the case of Orion, like it felt like Elle was his mouthpiece rather than Orion being his own character and being seen outside of the lens of Elle. So it felt like Elle's perspective overtook the narrative, her own prejudices, her own beliefs, her own biases overtook the narrative to the point where you couldn't really see the other diversities of the other characters that were in the novel as well. And for me, it felt anticlimactic getting to the point where we get to the final battle to only the resolution to be what it was, and essentially have a very neat ending tied with a bow, considering everything that happened and transpired in this respective story. So for me, it was one of the more pronounced letdowns of a trilogy that I have read in fantasy. And this isn't even a YA fantasy, it's an adult fantasy, but it has crossover appeal to YA, which that's another thing that I kind of frustrates me, because there are a lot of people who keep saying, "Oh, this is a YA series," but you very clearly see, even in this third installment, that is definitely not YA, especially with how it handles certain themes with respect to the characters and their interactions with each other. So I don't want to set up anybody with false expectations in terms of what to expect from this particular series, but um, I think the Golden Enclaves does set up a lot of false expectations for where it resolves compared to where it began, and it had a lot of potential, but unfortunately never realized the potential for it in terms of being consistent with its characters, consistent with its storyline, and then knowing where it was going to go, and then feeling satisfying in the journey of that. So that's where I will leave it. This was The Golden Enclave by Naomi Novik. I gave this no. I gave it 2 out of 5 stars, and part of the reason why I gave it 2 out of 5 stars was because of the strength of the audiobook, as well as certain things that it did well, but unfortunately it wasn't for me. So that's one of my more disappointing reads of this year. I won't say that I outright disliked it, but it really did not work for me personally. This next disappointing read was actually one that I did enjoy many parts of it, but unfortunately it wasn't one of the stronger reads for because of certain issues that were presented in this particular manga. And I think like anyone who's been following on Goodreads will know this next book, even though I haven't really talked about it on my booktube channel yet. This is a book that I read that was published by Tokyo Pop, and I read it for the first time this year in August because I got it as a galley from NetGalley, and I was going through my backlogs and I saw it like, oh, I got approved for this. I feel bad that I haven't had the chance to be able to read this until later on in the year, and it was published in 2022, but it was published early in the year in February. This was I'm Looking for Serious Love by Shoko Rakuta. And this particular story is a yaoi or boys love manga, which follows one college student who is moving to the city from the country he's moving. His name is Kyohei, and he ends up moving next to a very outgoing, very interesting playboy named Takara in the spectrum of their apartment in Tokyo. And so he's always been teased for being a bit of a country boy, a bit of a granny's boy because he's very attached to his grandmother. But essentially, when these two meet each other, they definitely have like hot and cold personalities, and you can see them clashing in terms of the city boy versus the country boy, and their different their different quirks. But what did not work for me this particular manga was the number of non-consensual interactions that Kyohei and Takara, and it's usually from Takara's and where it's non-consensual in terms of the way that he makes advances towards Kyohei, that I did not necessarily care for in this particular manga. And the other part of it is that I wish that certain elements could have been developed better for this particular manga, for the characterization. For I did like some of the characters, like Kyohei's grandma is very sweet and very lovable in terms of the way that she interacts with Kyohei and the other characters. But essentially for me, especially with the way certain characters are villainized and how they interact with the main characters in here, I did not care for that as much as other um, boys love and yaoi manga that actually treat the subject a little bit better than it did with respect to I'm Looking for Serious Love. So it's not that I dislike this particular manga. It's more like it was disappointing for me because I thought it would do much better. There were parts of it that were enjoyable and lovable, but then the parts that weren't great did impact the things that I loved about it. So I would say that I gave this 2.5 out of 5 stars, so I did enjoy pieces of it, but unfortunately, it wasn't among the better manga books that I picked up, even especially with respect to Boys Love because I ended up loving the series Given um, by Natsuki Izu, and I really enjoyed like the way that the author established the relationship between the boys, both the high school students and the college students for Given, versus this one. I just felt like it needed to have a bit more than what it had to really make it stand out, plus deal with some of its more difficult themes better than what it did. So that is I'm Looking for Serious Love by Shoko Rakuta. A disappointing read for me, not a bad read, but just disappointing for what I expected of it. So now I'm going to talk about the worst books that I read in the year of 2022. And one of these is actually a re release of a novella that was originally published as a part of an anthology called Quickies, which was published back in 2020, I believe, a romance anthology with a lot of very well known authors who contributed to these very quick stories of romance in new adult. The premise of this particular anthology is that they're quick stories that are romantic and steamy and showcase the budding relationships or even the romantic interactions of these respective characters within this anthology. And it comes from a range of different authors, like in this particular compilation, including A.L. Jackson, Ali Martinez, L. Kennedy, Helena Hunting, Corinne Michaels, Kennedy Ryan, Willow Winter, Serena Bowen. Serena Bowen had one of my favorite stories in this particular anthology, so I'm not going to be talking about anybody else's contributions to this particular anthology except for one, and that is the one that was released as an individual story this year, um, Hoodlum Heat by K. Webster. And I know that a lot of people know about the controversy that happened with K. Webster with the publication of this particular novella, but it was just a bad association from start to finish. And I talked about it on my Twitter feed, and I talked about it in my review on Goodreads um, as part of this collective review that I had on Quickies. But long story short, Jacoby Diem was the best part of this particular novella, which is part of the. I think it was the Hood River Hoodlums. I think it was called the. I'm trying to remember the series name that Kay Webster had, which has now been she apologized on TikTok and said that she was going to do better in terms of stuff. But the fact that not only she was highlighting a black character in association with hoodlums, which if you know the association, and I'm just going to say specifically the term hoodlum, stereotypical association that has negative connotations towards black men and black people within the black community. So the fact that she tied that particular term to him, even though she showcases a range of these different guys from different backgrounds, and this thing was just a bad sign from start to finish. And then there are other microaggressions in this particular novella that really just made my skin crawl when I read it, because I'm like, did you not understand the weight and the gravity of these associations and like this kind of ambiguity when you wrote this and put it out into the world? And I do hope that the author learns from this and that other people don't replicate that, because it was seriously uncomfortable to read. Like just the level of negative associations and like just the stereotyping that happened even in it, if even in this brief novella. I No, it just did not work for me. None of it worked for me. I gave it 1 star, and really the 1 star was from the strong audiobook narration, but everything else just did not work for me, unfortunately. I'll leave a link to my review of Hoodlum Heat for your reference from my blog, as well as on my Goodreads. I just it was one of the worst reads that I had this year, and yeah. So that is Hoodlum Heat, part of the Hood River Hoodlums series by K. Webster. 1 out of 5 stars. Definitely the worst novella that I read this year. So now you may ask, okay, Rose, what was your worst book that you read in 2022? And this was actually a galley that I got from NetGalley that I read way later than what I was approved for. Yeah, May 11th of 2020. And I actually ended up picking it up this year for the first time. And this was from an author that was new to me in terms of, I had heard rumors that this was one of her weakest narratives, and there were like people that I've trusted in terms of picking up this author had said, you know, Rose, you may want to try other works by this author to have a better idea of what her stronger narratives would be. But I said, since I have it as a galley, let me try it anyway. But unfortunately, everything about this book from start to finish was absolutely terrible, and an absolutely terrible experience for me. This is The Hunter by L.J. Shen. Where do I start with this particular book? I gave this 0 stars, and I'm not even regretful of that choice, because nothing about this book unfortunately worked for me. This is essentially the story of a guy who named Hunter, who essentially has to rehabilitate his image in the spectrum of things when a scandal rocks his world and his family trying to cover up this particular transgression, which I'll get into in just a second in terms of how bad it is and why Hunter was never going to be a character that worked for me. But Hunter essentially has to rehabilitate his image in terms of like being not as promiscuous, not as like being seen in the public eye as a better example than what he has displayed. So his family hires on one of his childhood friends who has a much better image than he does, and that would be Sailor, who is an Olympic hopeful, competes in archery, and essentially she has to stay around Hunter for the duration of this time that he's rehabilitating his image, saying, you know, you can't have sex with reckless abandon, you can't do any of these kinds of promiscuous activities and things like that. His family thinks that Sailor will keep him in line, which it's not in the cards in terms of him being the person that keeps his image intact, because he ends up falling for Sailor and Sailor ends up falling for him. And this book navigates that that rocky relationship between the two of them. So much of this book has rampant instances of sexism, misogyny, um, perceived sexual assault that's brushed aside and paid off by the family of Hunter, and Hunter does not give a crap about the things that he does. He does not care about Sailor's well-being. He keeps calling her carrot top against her will, has no respect for her boundaries, even ridicules her and sexualizes her when she is injured. And the level of microaggressions that are made that are anti-Asian as well as anti-Black in here, I was stunned to read about. I was so stunned and just flummoxed in terms of how much anti-Blackness and anti-Asian stereotypes are presented in this book. And I'm just like, what are you doing? Why would you do this? It doesn't make sense. I just wanted to read a story about two people who I wanted to root for in the spectrum of this new adult erotic story, and it just ended up crashing and burning from start to finish. Just nothing about this worked for me in the duration of it. I couldn't even enjoy it. I sincerely could not enjoy this book. So I said, this is the first book of LJ Shen's I'm going to read, and I don't want to go through that experience again if this is what her other narratives casually employ in terms of these kind of like heartful stereotypes and projections in terms of these different groups is going to be. I don't want to read that. I want to read a romance. I don't want to read something that is hurtful and just reiterates all these harmful stereotypes. So I gave this 0 stars. I'm not going to go back to it. I'm definitely not going to reread this. So I just decided, nope, it just better to let it go. Just better to let it go and keep going. So that's all that I have to say about The Hunter by LJ. And yeah, I gave this 0 stars, and it's definitely my worst read of 2022. So that's it for this particular video. I I had a much better reading year than what the last two and even the previous disappointing reads would be, but I hope that this gives you an idea of in terms of why these particular reads in the order that I talked about them did not work for me respectively. So I'm going to be very happy once we get to the books that I can gush about that I read in 22, because there was a lot of them compared to the few that did not work for me or that I just outright did not like at all. But if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and hit the notification bell to be notified of when I post new videos. Thank you again for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next video. Bye.